All righty, welcome. I am Heather Pierce Campbell, the legal website warrior. I'm an attorney and legal coach based here in Seattle, Washington, serving online information entrepreneurs throughout the US and the world. Welcome to another episode of Guts, Grit, and Great Business. I've really been looking forward to this conversation, and you'll find out here why in just a minute. But I'm super happy to welcome my new friend, Robert MacPhee. Welcome, Robert.
So happy to be your new friend. Well, thank you. I'm happy to
You
be here.
know, it's
I
it's
need all the
not
friends I can get.
me too. I will say me too as a mom who's also an attorney and entrepreneur, and has worked virtually since 2012. Yeah, right.
Oh,
So yeah, it's been a while. I can get a little cabin fevery, honestly. But I love making new friends, and you don't have a choice in the matter. That's the problem, really, is that you agreed to come spend an hour with me on my podcast. And so I'm going to make you my new friend, whether you want to be or not.
all right. It wasn't that hard.
Right. Perfect. Perfect. Well, I remember when we first connected, I really enjoyed speaking with you. I think we had a 15-minute introductory call scheduled, and we spoke for like an hour. Like
Yeah, we
I
didn't do
ran you
real well
way.
with staying within that limit. Yeah.
No, we didn't. And we met through our mutual friend, Melanie Benson, who I just love. She's a dear online friend to me. And we just met in person actually for the first time
Oh,
last
really?
year. Yeah, which is super fun. We met first in a business mastermind. And then haven't just known each other for years, but we actually got to meet up in person last year, which was like icing on the cake. So much fun. But for those of you that don't know Robert MacPhee, I'm super excited to introduce Robert. We connected first on a conversation that had something to do with ethics. And I think it was probably business ethics and business, but obviously I live in the legal world, and so I probably had a legal, slant on it. But Robert lives in the world of somebody who teaches individuals and companies about values. And so I'm going to go ahead and read your bio, Robert, but stick around, folks, because we're going to get into a really juicy conversation today. So Robert is the creator of the Excellent Decisions Values-Based Leadership Program. He's the former director of training for the Canfield Training Group, having worked closely for many years with Jack Canfield, the co-creator of the Chicken Soup for the Soul book series and the author of the Success Principles. Robert is a founding member and former executive director of the Transformational Leadership Council, a co-founder of the Southern California Association of Transformational Leaders, and a former executive board member of the San Francisco Bay Area chapter of Conscious Capitalism. Robert is a knowledgeable, fun, okay, we're going to test you on that one, Robert. Fun and engaging speaker and facilitator. He is an expert in experiential learning, peak performance, values clarification, and leadership. Those are 4 topics that I love, Robert, so you're in a good spot. He has spoken at corporate conferences, industry trade shows, government conferences, colleges, universities, high schools, and he has been a featured presenter at a wide variety of corporate events and trainings. Robert currently lives in Sonoma, California, is a committed father and former marathon runner, and has become an aspiring wine aficionado. And by the way, this is super important, you guys. He just published a book, Living a Values-Based Life, which came out end of 2023. So that's really exciting. Congratulations, Robert. So happy to have you here today.
Thank you. Listening to you read all that makes me realize why I'm so tired.
Right? I mean, you earned it. You earned it, right?
Yeah, no, it's been a very blessed journey, and I love the work I'm doing. And it doesn't surprise me, based on our previous conversation, that those 4 topics are like, "Ooh, yeah, let's talk about that for you."
Yeah,
So,
right. Not everybody wants to jump into that, but I think they're awesome topics. Talk to us about how you got started in like values is not a place where most people live as an area of study, right? And an area of expertise.
it's
Uh,
not, and that's part of the answer to your question is, and this is a little bit of an embarrassing story for me because I've been doing coaching and consulting work in one form or another for close to 25 years now. And about 10 years ago, I was struggling with my own values. I just couldn't
mm,
get couldn't get a sense of clarity about my own values in a way that I felt like was really useful to me. Like I could remember
Mm,
them and I could really apply them and feel like I was really able to live my life in a life. It was just confusing.
mm,
And my own solution for resolving that was to take the whole values conversation and divide it into two categories. And the first category was what is important to me, like the things that are
mm,
important to me, like linguistically, language wise, it was nouns. It was
mm,
people, places, things. It's my relationships with my children, and it was the contribution I want to make in the world, and my own health and well-being, things like that. And then on the other side, in a separate category, which is really closely related to values, which I consider values to be what is important to me. But a whole
mm,
separate category is how I want to show up in the world, like the qualities and characteristics that I want to fully embody and show up in every single day. And for me, those are things like humility and
mm,
kindness and caring, which kind of go together, and peacefulness and calm and courageous. Like, so that's also really important to me to show up that way in the world. But the problem was when I took my relationships with my children and I put it in the same basket as courageous, that's where I got confused. And it was like, well,
mm,
those are not the same thing. They really don't belong together. They don't belong on the same list. But as soon as I separated them and I had a list of what I now call my highest priorities, like what is most important
mm,
to me, and my highest, like my most important, what we call ways of being, like how I
mm,
want to show up in the world, I can literally look at those lists and I have them in my phone so I can review them. I have a little alarm that goes off every day and I take a quick peek at my values. And I can say, like, how am I doing? Am I putting my time and attention on the things that are most important to me? And am
mm,
I showing up the way I want to show up? And I can adjust and improve accordingly. So suddenly values went from confusing to really like useful and helpful. And I can check in and every single day move a little bit in the direction of living a little bit more in alignment with my values. So it was hugely helpful. And you would
mm.
think, since I'm a coach and consultant at that point for whatever 15 years, that I would share it with other people. But the embarrassing part of the story is I actually didn't. Like it just didn't occur to me. It solved the problem for me. And then I just moved on with my
Just
life. And
held
it
it under
wasn't
the vest.
until,
Yep.
yeah, it wasn't until early 2023. I was working on another project where we really had to tap into people's values to get
Mm,
people's attention, to get them interested in this project. It was a social justice project. And and the person I was working with said, "Oh, tapping into values, no problem, because my excellent decisions work is making decisions based on vision and values instead of
mm,
external stress and pressure." And she had heard that over and over and over again. She's like, "Oh, values, no problem. That's what you do, right?" And I kind of went, yeah, I guess so." Like, but it really forced me to take a look at what I had done 10 years
mm,
ago and put something together to help with that
mm,
project. And the response was unbelievable. Like you were saying, like it's people know it's important,
mm,
but not a lot of people have really done the work. Or if they haven't done the work, they haven't done it in a way that's memorable and implementable. So it's not creating a lasting impact.
mm.
So the response has been unlike anything I've done professionally in terms of people just kind of having a you had me at hello kind
Like
of
an aha.
response
Yeah.
because people want values clarity, but they don't really know how to get there.
Mm. Well, it is interesting. I mean, I love hearing about your journey and even this realization, like midway through your own path, that there was this disconnect happening in the dialogue and processing of like, how do we identify our values, right? And when you said your second batch of words, right? Courage, honesty, whatever they
Mhm.
were. I think that's what people typically think of as values. I think people often come up with those words as like, yeah, well, like, of course they are my values, but it's very distinct from how do we live those? How do we demonstrate our values? How does it actually show up in our life
Yeah.
in various areas? And I think that's where things can collapse sometimes. And I remember doing my very first like proper values exercise. I can't remember if you and I talked about this when we first connected, but it was clear back when I was in my very early 20s and my mom had been diagnosed with terminal brain cancer. And so I was in a period of law school where I was also facing deep, deep grief and, struggling with like some bigger life things. And I saw a therapist who was brilliant and took me immediately to this values exercise that he he had created, and it was across a series of categories. So relationships, but it was more defined than that. It was like communication sending, communication receiving, fun, play, like maybe 13 categories. And then he had you choose 3 ways to express in basically like an affirmation form how you are demonstrating a value in that category. So, ways, so for you you'd make an affirmative statement around how you send communications in
Mhm.
accordance with your values, how you receive communications in accordance with your values, right? So it was very much tying it to how you show up in life. And I remember, and I can't remember if it was before or after the exercise, he said to me, happiness is really simple. It's living a life in accordance with your values.
Yeah, it's how we measure. And that's the craziest thing about people not really being clear and not being able to articulate their highest values,
Yes.
because I believe we all want to live a life of meaning and purpose
Mm,
and, like you said, happiness. And how do we measure that? Like, if we
mhm.
really don't know our values, chances are we're living our life to some degree in alignment with the all the demands that are put on us everywhere and every day and all the time. Somebody else out there wants us to live our life in a certain way so that
Yes.
their needs are getting met.
Well,
um
I was listening to Greg I don't know how to say his last name, Essentialism, right? The book Essentialism. You don't prioritize your life, somebody else will do it for you.
yeah,
And I think
Jim Rohn used to say, if you're not clear about your own goals, you'll be working with someone who does have that level of clarity. Like,
that's
yeah.
right. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
it. And I think so often people bump up against that values conversation, like truly for the first time, maybe in the midst of crisis, right? Certainly, I think often in the midst of some level of hardship, whether it's you're consistently experiencing like a rub at work, or, you know what I mean? Maybe you're having some, uh, dichotomy or gap in like the way home life is going and the way that you would really like for your home life to be going, right? I think these are the kinds of like big questions and issues that come up that really force people to be like, what am I doing? What is it that really matters
Yeah, but unfortunately, that's a really hard time to do this kind of work.
to
So it's
do
kind of
the
it's
work?
almost paradoxical, and it's a really good point you bring up, and I think it's one of the most valuable things of, like, someone's listening to this podcast and they're not in the middle of one of those emotionally charged or really
Mhm,
difficult situations. Now is the time when you have the bandwidth and you can pause and really be thoughtful and, you know, take a first stab at it and then consider it for a while and really get it to the point where you really land on values that just feel on purpose for you. Then
mm,
when the emotionally charged or really difficult situations come up, like you were in when you were dealing
mhm,
with the therapist and going through that exercise, I believe it would have been a lot easier if you had had the opportunity earlier to do the values work, to revisit and reconnect to and say, well, what do I want to let guide me through this difficult or emotionally charged
mhm,
situation? And
mhm,
it's hard to do that kind of work, that really thoughtful,
mhm,
present, you know, heart work, if you will,
mhm,
when we're under pressure, like when the stuff is hitting the fan.
mhm.
That's a really hard time to go, oh, let me pause and just reflect on what my highest values are. You're like,
Oh,
my
certainly.
hair is on fire. I'm not pausing and
Yeah.
reflecting on anything.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Well, it's like, how else do we have those catalysts occur? And obviously, if you're listening right now, let this be the catalyst where if you have wondered in your own life how your values are displayed or how they're showing up, or whether you're really recognizing what your true values are. And that actually is a whole separate topic. Like, I wonder what you think. And I think we talked briefly about this, about the Dr. John DeMartini work, where he argues you're already expressing your values. People fight. They have that internal dialogue of like, I should want to do this, or I should be doing this better. But his premise is that you can't really change your core because they're part of like who you are meant to like express as a person, in this life. So somebody that is an entrepreneur that is going to like lead a revolution in the world because that's their mission, is probably going to have a work-life balance value that looks very different than somebody who is like here to be the best mom on earth,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, and Dr. DeMartini, and I love him in his work. He's focused more on identifying what your current values are and what the
Mhm.
real drivers of your behavior are right now in your life.
Mhm.
My values work gets there, but it starts with creating what I call aspirational values, like what I aspire to, how I would really
Mhm.
like to be living my life. And that may or may not, in most people's lives, there's some areas where we're doing pretty good.
Uh,
We're living our life in alignment with the way we want to be. And it's, we put time and attention on that. And then we get to number 3 on the list and we go, uh-oh, that one,
y-
not so much.
Yeah.
Like you said, oftentimes it's that work-life balance thing, right? Like
Mhm.
I say, I'm really committed to being a great dad, but I haven't been to my daughter's soccer game in a month because I keep having a meeting or work or travel or whatever. Because what I'm really committed to, what my behavior shows I'm committed to, is my
Yes.
business and making money and finance and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
So what I like to do is have people identify their aspirational values. Like, how do I really want to be living my life?
Mm,
And then go back and do an assessment. And this was one of the best things about this separation into 2 categories for me. It's very simple to assess and see, how am I doing now? And Jack Canfield, who you mentioned in my bio, who's a co-creator of the Chicken Soup for the Soul series, and I had the opportunity to work with him. He used to ask a question in his workshops, like, what am I making more important than
mhm.
whatever? So when I come across that thing on my list called my relationships with my children, and I realize I'm not really putting time and attention, the question is, what am I making more important than? Which is really a values question, because our
Yeah.
values are what is most important to us. And if I'm making, work and family are both really important, and it's hard to balance those 2 out. And many people would say there's no such thing as balance. You're always going to want a little bit more of one, a little bit more of the other.
Mhm.
But if I'm spending 2 hours a day surfing YouTube videos and my relationships with my kids are sacrificing, then
Yeah.
hopefully the values clarity will drive me really quickly in the direction of, no, that, it's entertaining, but it's really not important to me.
Yeah.
And look at my amazing kids. I want to put that time with them.
Well, and I think you raise a really important point with this distinction between aspirational values and the values that your behavior is demonstrating, right?
Hmm.
And the reason being is one, behavior is learned, but so often we are imitating behavior or inheriting behavior or mindsets that shape our beliefs or our values from parents where they're really not our own, right? This is the whole midlife crisis thing. Like
And not just parents.
what
Yeah.
version of my life have I been living where my behavior demonstrates values that are not really mine?
And that's actually, it sounds kind of depressing, but it's also a real gift when people become aware of that. And there's a
Yes.
model at the beginning of my book that I call the change paradox model, that explains like what really drives the way we think, the decisions we make, and the actions we take. And a lot of times it's what I call external influences. You mentioned parents, but it's not just parents. It's my parents, it's my boss, it's my friends, it's the rest of my family, it's media, it's
Mhm.
social media. It is, in today's world, if you really think about it, we are bombarded with all these external influences that are telling us what we should do, what we have to do, what we need to do to be successful, or to be a good father, or whatever it is. And and it's subconscious for most people. It's like they're
Totally.
not really consciously thinking about it. And the change paradox model is like, okay, if you want to make a change in that, then you're going to bump up against the fact that as human beings, yeah, we desire change. We want a better
Yeah.
life, we want a better relationship, we want to make more money, whatever. But then when change happens, what do? We resist it, right? Like
Yeah.
it's just part of being human. Like, oh my God, more money. No, that's dangerous. Who knows?
That that
You
am-
can get
that
robbed or what?
amygdala gets
Yeah,
busy. Yes.
exactly. Yeah. So
Uh-huh.
so there's a paradox that happens. And in order to get to a place where our values, like our self-image, our belief about who we are and who we really want to be, if to get to a place where that's driving the way we think and the decisions we
Mhm.
make and the actions we take, Like we need to be aware of all those external influences and be willing to start saying no to at least some of them to make room for our values to step in and be the primary driver. And like we were talking about before, like if you really want to live a life of happiness and purpose and meaning and productivity and satisfaction, these are all the words that come up around kind of the benefits of living a values-based life. You've got to know what those values are so you can measure. Like
Right.
I think you and I are pretty like-minded, but if we sit down, there's going to be some differences in your list of what's most important to you and
Mhm.
mine. So what you would use to measure like whether you're really on purpose would be a little
Mhm.
bit different than mine. But
Yeah,
we got to know.
totally. It's like the compass, right? It's like,
Oh
are
yeah,
we,
and the target,
yes,
like
are we on track? Are we looking at the right map? Am I working from, the wrong map? Totally.
yeah, and that's a big shift in my business right now because I told you the whole excellent decisions concept, which has been great for me. Living your life and making your decisions based on vision and values, what's really important to you instead of all those external influences.
Mhm.
That's great. But the reason I'm really zeroing in on values right now is if I have a really compelling vision and it sounds great at a cocktail party or whatever, but it doesn't line up with my values, it's ultimately not going to get me. I make
You're
that
not
vision a
gonna do the
reality.
things to get there. No.
Yeah, I'm not going to be
Yeah.
motivated, like you said. And even if I do get there, when I get there, I'm going to go,
Not
it's not
all
going
that
to
it's
be
cracked up to
quite the
be.
celebration that I ultimately want it to be.
Yeah. Well, talk to us more on that point because I feel like one of the pretty significant failures of human wiring is we don't actually know very well what's going to make us happy. And I think so often those visions, right, are based around like, oh, what we think is an expression of like where we should be going in life, what we should ultimately be achieving. And I think so much of it is based around happiness. How do you help people spot the disconnect? Right? Because I think it's a really challenging thing to realize sometimes like, wait, why do I want this as my ultimate vision? Like, I think it can take getting down the path a while to realize,
Mhm.
like, oh no, that's not the vision for me.
Yeah, and I would somewhat disagree with the premise that it's hard for us to figure those things out.
Hmm.
But I think what you're really saying is that those external voices for most people are so much louder and so much more persistent than any time we might take to really pause and go
Hmm.
inside and really ask the questions about, I mean, our minds and I believe our hearts. There's amazing research out of places like the Heart Math Institute
Hmm.
in down near Santa Cruz, California, about the thinking capacity, like the problem solving capacity of the heart. We get really good at like
Mm.
intellectually thinking things through, but when we pause and really go into our heart, and this is part of what we do in the book when we do the discovery of highest values in both categories, we do kind of the mental exercise to use the power of our mind, which is pretty amazing. But we also pause and tap into the heart. There's a couple of guided visualizations in there to really tap into that kind of energy. And my experience with working with people on this is that most people, if they're willing to pause like that and ask those questions, the mind and the heart are pretty darn good at coming up with the answers. And sometimes in a surprising way, sometimes at a deeper level, like we have people ask the same question, like a question like, what is important to you? And we ask it over and over again.
Mm.
And the first things that come out for people are usually the things they're familiar with. Well, what's important to me is making more money. What's important to me is, my family. And then, but we keep asking. And sometimes beneath those like obvious answers, I call them the cocktail party answers, right? Somebody asks
Yeah.
you at the cocktail party but they only ask you once. Nobody asks you like 20 times.
Yep.
But sometimes people have like epiphanies on the sixth or seventh or 10th or 12th question to
Mm.
say, well, what's really important to me? Like, what's really important to me is like all the people who are starving in the world. Like, I need to do something about that.
Mm.
And they're kind of like, where did that come from? Like, I don't even, that's like buried below all these layers of like
Yes.
survival and what all those external influences are telling me I need to do and I have to
Hmm.
do, and you got to do more of this. And if you don't do that, you won't be successful and da 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 da. And lurking down there is like someone's real like purpose and meaning Like I was just last night, I was at a movie screening. It was called Common Ground, and it's about regenerative farming.
Mm.
And it tied together so many things for me. Like I walked out of there like so excited about supporting regenerative farming because
Mhm.
like sometimes I don't know which direction to move. Like, is it social justice? Is it wealth inequity? Is it climate change? Like,
Tell
how do
me
I pick
about it.
whatever? But regenerative farming, after watching this movie last night, I was so fired up because it's like connected to all those
Yeah.
things. I was like, I want to get a lot more actively involved in this movement to change. I'll keep my language clean for your family friendly podcast, but this terrible situation of the food
Mhm.
industry.
Mhm.
I mean, what we get for food, the way we farm what we call food, the
Oh,
poisons that are in our food, the mental health and physical health ramifications of our, it's crazy.
it is
And
crazy.
a lot of it can be solved by just going back and farming food the way nature intended instead of trying to somehow outsmart nature. That's never a
Yeah.
very good idea. But that
No.
it really tapped me into a sense of what's really important to me. And one of the things on my highest list of values is contribution, like
Mhm.
making a contribution. And that's why I was working on that social justice project that I mentioned. But I feel compelled to like, I want to do stuff on climate change too. And this
Yeah.
whole wealth inequity thing in our country is so crazy. I want to work, you know. So then I end up like, I can't do it all. So I don't do anything sometimes. So,
Yeah. Well, and
um,
I think that's, yeah, that's it's an easy place for a lot of people to feel almost incapacitated because we have such access to information, to news stories, to everything. And one of my real learnings as a mom is like how to focus my energy so that I don't get pulled in directions where I have a bleeding heart and it impacts me when there's not an obvious next thing I can do about it, right? And so the
mhm.
question becomes, okay, what can I do? Where can I move the needle forward? What is in my lane to do, right? And I'm so clear on that.
Yeah.
And I think,
And it becomes actionable, right? Like, and
yes,
that's what
and
I'm
then
so, yeah, I think you and I share that. Like we're passionate about making it actionable. It keeps coming up because
yes,
it's a great conversation, values and oh yeah, that's a great idea and it's a great concept. But
totally.
how do we take it all the way to implementable and actionable? And
Yes.
like I'm
And I
working
think
with,
this is what a lot of people want to know in a way that seems clear and seems doable and also doesn't contribute to more burnout and more overwhelm and things that people are already experiencing that again disconnect us from our values-based living, right?
yeah. And this was part of what was really intriguing to me about being in a conversation with you and your audience on this podcast is because on an organizational level, there's far too many businesses and organizations out there that have done some form of values work, but
Mhm.
it's either on the wall gathering dust or it's in a drawer or a file cabinet somewhere. And if you really took a look at like on a scale of 0 to 10, how actionable has it really
Mhm.
become? That's where people kind of go, oh, well, actually, not really. Which is
Yeah.
which is such a shame because I think with individuals and with organizations, again, people want to have that feeling of making a difference and making a contribution and living and running their business in alignment with what's most important to them. And money
Mhm.
is a big part of that. We live in a world where making money again, the Jim Rohn comes up for me, like more money makes us more of who we really are, right? Like if I'm really living into those values, I told you, kindness and courageousness and humility. The truth is, if I double my income, I can express more kindness. I can express more humility. I can express, everything that's on my list. I can be more of that in the world
Yes.
that we live in because of more income, more
That's
money.
right. No, that's right. Yeah, I I was having a conversation with my 6-year-old about this whole, about paying attention to language and how people say funny things that don't make any sense, like money doesn't buy happiness, right? And stuff that we buy into, but and she was like, and I remember all the money stories even that I inherited as a kid, and you do look back on some of those and go like, what the heck? Where did these come from? You know,
Yeah.
because of course more money makes you more of who you really are. If you're a playful, generous, like, adventurous person, you get to express those values through money and allow other people to also experience more play and fun and like, and
Yeah.
who doesn't need that, you know? And that is such an important part of the conversation.
Well, and
And
it goes back to the aspirational values idea too,
yes.
because that equation of like making us more of who we already are,
Mhm.
that can apply to like the hardwired values, the values we've taken from the environments and the external influences.
Mhm.
Because if I'm so focused on, making more money and creating a successful business and just everybody else get out of my way, I don't care. It's all about making more money. The values that are really in play are selfishness and greed and things like that.
Mm.
And more money will make me more of that too.
Yes,
Like, and
exactly.
we see people who do that and then they get to the end of the game, whatever that looks like, and they're
Mm.
going, "Oh my God, what was I thinking? Like, this is not who I wanted to be. This is not the legacy
No,
I wanted to live." And I am very much in favor of make more money. Like, I think that's
no,
great. I want to make more money, but I don't want to sacrifice this idea of living my life in alignment with what's most important to me to do it. And
that's right.
I don't
It's
think I need to.
that trade
No.
I well, and that actually brings up a really interesting topic related, I mean, really central, I think, even in the discussion around values, is this idea around sometimes our values competing with each other,
Uh-huh.
right? So I really value the work I do through my business and uplifting entrepreneurs and small business owners and like working and serving is one of my core values, right? So is being a mom.
Hmm.
And these things do not always coexist that nicely,
Yep.
right? And so we we end up in this dialogue around, I think some days really negotiating our values and which one is going to win out.
Uh-huh. And this is,
Um,
to me, this is why the values can't end up in a drawer. I told you, like
yeah.
mine are on my phone
Yeah.
because we can start drifting in the direction. You clearly love what you're doing. You love the work you do. You love your business. You're doing this
Mhm.
podcast. You engaging with all these amazing people. If you don't remember your values on a consistent basis, it would be easy to drift further than you want to drift away from being an amazing mom and an amazing businesswoman. Like, and again, I believe you can absolutely do both.
Totally. But it's an
But if you forget,
ongoing,
if you,
active conversation. That's the thing about values is like it is really the conversation we're having every day
yeah,
about how we're going to spend our time, how we're going to show up, whether we make this choice or that choice, right?
yeah. Yeah, well, this is another interesting thing that came up in this whole values conversation. And I actually learned it from someone who has a podcast about
Mm.
values.
Oh,
But
fun.
but they talked about the concept of borrowing values. And I was like, what? What does that mean?
Mm.
But the idea is like I can have my core values, I can have my highest priorities, I can have the
Yeah.
way I want to show up in the world. But I might be dealing, for instance, with like kind of a crisis in my business, for
Mhm.
instance. I might be like, okay, this is an unexpected situation and I've really got to put some extra attention on this. And I might need to show up in a little bit different way. Like I might have a crisis in my business and some of those things I listed about peaceful and calm and humble and
Are
kind
out
and
the
caring.
window.
Yeah, well, not out the window though. They
No,
stay
no.
remain. But what I do is I borrow values like situationally to handle that circumstance
Yeah,
without losing who I really am. So I can
totally.
stay humble, I can stay kind and caring, but I'm reeling in a little strength and a little
Yeah.
discipline, a little focus, and a little
Decisiveness,
extra dose of
discernment.
courage to throw in
Yes.
there in order to
Yes.
get through that situation. Now, I don't want to bring in the greed and the selfishness and
Mhm.
the uncaring that's going to balance out the caring.
Mhm.
I can address that situation in my business and still be who I really am,
Yeah.
but be stronger and be more disciplined and be more focused, whatever it might be, in order to either resolve a situation or just up level something to the
Mhm.
degree I want it to be at.
Mhm.
So it's
No.
very empowering for people to think about that and go, oh, well, depending on how things, and it could go the other way, most of the time I'm Mr. Driven and hard, and now it's affecting my health. Like
Yeah.
maybe someone needs to bring in a little bit more peace and calm and relaxation and spirituality or whatever it is, and borrow that for a little while until things kind of
Mm.
kind of get back to equilibrium.
No, it's so true. And that's a great example. Like when something unexpected occurs or we feel, off our game, because there's other, like in the personal development world, there's other work around, like studying the greats and also recognizing, the people and the leaders in your life that you admire, like how you actually can own some of those traits in yourself, right? I was
Yeah.
having a conversation with my husband actually last night. We were watching, he likes watching those, he's a real biology nature guy. And there are those shows that have the wildlife, what is it? I'm spacing out on their titles. They work for the government, but they
Like
enforce rules.
rangers?
Yeah, like rangers around enforcing rules that, protect wildlife or
Yeah,
like
the
the
warden,
hunting, the
the game
wardens.
warden.
There you go. Anyways, I will find that he sometimes will have those on and we get sucked into a show about game wardens running around and of course interacting with all kinds of really interesting people. And there were these three folks fishing. Of course, none of them had a fishing license. And really what there was two poles down on the ground, one propped up in something that held it up, and a woman who had had previous encounters with the law, and he recognized her. He was like, have I seen you here before? She was like, yes. He's like, have I arrested you before? And she's like, yes. He's like, okay, whose fishing poles are these? And he's pointing to the two on the ground, and she's like, I don't know. And the two guys there are like, we not ours. And it's this whole like very funny thing happening. Funny, not funny, but funny to watch. And she tells a fib about, well, I was fly fishing with this one, and then I had left this one at like acting like she was manning two of the fishing poles. And then the ranger looked at her and goes, yeah, I don't think so. And he just like goes on to the next thing that he has to do. And my husband looked at me, he's like, oh, I wish I could be more like that. Like just so direct, but just like easy about it, like, no, I don't think so. And it wasn't rude. It wasn't a big deal. It was just like getting on with business. And I said, well, why can't you? Why
Yeah.
couldn't you be like, if you have this desire to be more direct, like maybe there's something in you that hasn't been living into that. And anyways, so it led to this very interesting conversation. But I think that's sometimes the way that people recognize that they're not living a value,
Uh-huh.
right? Or not living into something that's really an authentic or an aspirational value is like at some point, maybe he learned to tone down his own voice or to not be so direct or whatever, right? I don't know the
Yeah.
backstory. But is
Or he
is
might
that the way?
notice the consequences of that. Like he might say,
Yeah,
like, I'm not achieving in this particular area of my life because I'm too willing to
not
let
being,
people steamroll me or whatever. But and then he can use, and this is part of what we do in the book and the approach we use is that idea of asking yourself, who do I know in my life? Or maybe I don't even know them, but I just know them by
no, of
reputation.
them. Yeah.
But who do I know who's really accelerating or excelling in that area? So it might be, I want to be a better parent. Like who in my life do I consider like a really great parent? And it
Yeah.
could very quickly come up with a list of 3 or 4 people. And then you can go to those ways of being and say, okay,
Yes.
how does that person show up? Like when I think of them as a parent, like what words would I use to describe them? And it wouldn't be like impatient
That's
and
right.
frustrated
Irritated all
and
the
angry.
time. Yeah.
They would be kind and they would be caring and they
Flexible
would
and
be empathetic
funny.
and they would be patient. Yeah, all those kinds of things. And again, then you can just borrow those values.
Mm.
And courageousness actually ended up on my highest list of values because I borrowed it first. Like it was when
Ah,
I was just getting this values work going on, and there was a lot of conversations I needed to get in that I was kind of resisting. I don't know if I'm ready, making up all these stories. And I was just like, I need to be more courageous. Like I need to be willing to engage in these conversations and accept whatever comes out of them. And sometimes it'll go great and sometimes it
mm,
won't. But I recognized I needed more courage. So I borrowed it
mm.
and it worked out so great. I put it on my top 5 list. Like it's like, oh, I definitely need more of this. So
Oh, I love it. Well, that also demonstrates, this this concept, which we're learning so much more about, right? This growth mindset, the fact that things are not static. We as people
No,
do
not at
not need
all.
to be static. We don't need to be the person that we were last decade or even last year if that's not who we really want to be. And not
Who
only
wants
that,
the same values they had in high school? Not me.
that's right. Yeah, right.
No.
But it's such a great demonstration of the fact that we can just pay attention to that inner voice and lean into those wants and those desires and those noticings around like, oh, well, what if I was a little bit more like that? And I love the concept of borrowing a value, especially when you see one demonstrated so well by somebody in your life. I think that makes it more accessible, right?
Yeah, and hopefully when people hear that, they're aware, like it really is that simple. Like I could come off of this
Mm,
conversation with you and I could just, guys, God, I just love how engaging she is. I just, for the rest of this weekend, we're recording this on a Friday. Like, you know what? I'm going to borrow engaging this weekend. I'm going to be more engaging and see how that is. And we can literally just do
yeah.
that. We can just decide to play with a value, with a way of being, with showing up in the world in a way that we would like to be more of. And I
Mm.
might, at the end of the weekend, I might go, geez, I don't know how she does it. That was exhausting. I don't want to be so engaging anymore. Or, or,
That is
because
going
for some
off the
people,
top five. That is
yeah, I
definitely
mean,
not on my top five.
yeah, I'm kind of an introvert, like being really engaging
Mm,
and being really social, like it drains energy for me.
yeah,
But I know for some people,
yeah,
it's really it adds energy for them. So
mm,
we're all different. And but values,
totally.
you're absolutely right. They change, and that's okay. It doesn't
Hmm.
mean like we did something wrong and we didn't get it right the first time or whatever.
Hmm.
It's just the nature of it. Things change as we go through life.
Well, it feels so fun. I think that there's even a part of me that felt like, gosh, well, maybe values, especially like some really distinct ones, are just always a part of us. And maybe that's true, but maybe it's also much more about choice and experimenting. And how free and fun does that feel? Because how many times do you spend time around somebody where you're like, huh, what would it like to be that lighthearted or that, even silly or whatever it is, right? And this idea that we can just try it on or borrow it,
Yeah.
I think, I don't know, there's just something really refreshing and fun about that because I think we tend to, especially as adults, get way too stagnant in our identities and thinking, like I launched a book club at the start of this year because I really wanted to bring like a more in-person element back to my life, especially for women and interesting conversations. And we read The Power of Fun last month by Catherine Price, and it was so fascinating to hear all these women because I was a kid that as a child just got told repeatedly how serious I was. I was a little kid that I mean from a pretty young age probably just carried the weight of the shoulders. I mean the weight of the world on my shoulders is how I felt, like big problems were in my head, I was not probably a very typical kid, but what was typical about my experience is all these women in this book club group, which I also find fascinating. Like, are these the type of women that are attracted to a book club? Um, we're all told as kids how serious they were.
Oh,
And
interesting.
so the internal messaging for all of us is like, oh, well, you're not the fun kid. You're not the fun friend. You're the serious one, right? And,
At
but,
what age? If you had to guess, what age did you make that decision?
oh, at least by five, at least
Yeah,
by
and
age
and
five.
I think that's what Dr. DeMartini is talking about because at that age they say like 0 to 7 or 8 or
That's
something like that. It just comes in unfiltered, right? We
yeah,
don't ask questions. It's just like
yeah,
that's who I am.
yeah.
Everyone's telling me that's who I am,
That's
and
it.
yeah, and I think it doesn't ever like really go away,
Mm,
but the power of a realization, like you said, well, like, yeah, that's kind of what I've taken on, but I can decide, do I want to be more of that? Do I want to be less of
mm.
that? I remember my kids grew up around this kind of work, this kind of conversation. I was
Your
actually
kids are all
working,
brilliant, kind
yeah, they're
humans
all
running
like,
around in the world.
yeah, now they call me on it. That's the worst part. But they grew up. I was actually working with Jack Canfield while they were very young. So, and I
Mhm.
didn't have, I tell people I didn't have a PowerPoint and a flip chart at the dinner table or anything, but they literally grew up around this work.
Osmosis. They got
And
it through
so they
osmosis.
just they
Mm.
just get it. And
Yeah.
and at one point I was talking about like, oh, I'm not good at music. And my daughter, she kind of crosses her arms and she looks at me and she goes, really?
Can we
Like, who decided
rephrase
that?
that?
Who
Yes.
decided that? Like, what do you
Yeah.
mean? Like, and I
Yeah.
was like, dang, like if she wasn't so right, I'd get
Oh,
mad at her.
totally.
But I
No,
was like,
that's
oh, and now I have a guitar hanging in my office and I'm not very good at playing it, but that conversation got me to think about it. Like, I'd actually like to know just enough guitar where if I'm feeling stressed out, I could pull my guitar off the wall and just strum some chords. And, I'm not going to be doing open mic night down at the club on the corner, but it's very calming and very peaceful for me
yeah.
to strum just some really nice chords on the guitar. But I
Yeah.
never would have done that if my daughter hadn't called me on the fact that I had anchored into one of those things that who knows where that came from. But no,
Totally.
I'm not musical.
That's right. Yeah.
Really? Who decided that?
Well, and how much effort to combat that messaging, not only for ourselves, but, for our kiddos and just really paying attention to it. But,
Yeah.
the one of
How
the
old
big,
are your kids?
so my daughter's 6 and my son is 11.
No, that's so great that you're in the midst of all these kinds of conversations
Mhm.
when they're young like that. Because it really, I mean, I called it my unfair advantage as a parent. Like,
Oh, yeah.
most parents don't get to hang around with Jack Canfield while their kids were growing up.
Right.
And I love to do work with young people whenever I can to kind of give back in that regard and kind of
Mm,
share the toolbox that I had. And it's
mm.
so great to see how quickly kids, like, they hear a conversation like this and they just get it. They just
Oh my
immediately,
gosh, they're
they don't
just
need all
little
the cajoling and
sponges.
the
No,
convincing and
they
whatever.
don't.
Yeah.
No, they don't. It is really brilliant to watch. And that growth mindset language and that, affirmation language, like they go off to school every day and they have a whole little series of affirmations that they got to create that we do in the car. And it just makes my heart so happy because they say it with conviction.
Yeah.
And I think back to my childhood and I'm like, man, the difference of one belief changing for a
Uh-huh.
lifetime
I
can
was
make a dramatic difference.
My daughter was in middle school. My youngest daughter was in middle school, and I could tell she was really missing me. And
Mm,
so I invited her to come with me on a trip that I was taking. It was when I was working with Jack, and we were doing a series of one-day workshops. And she came with me, actually to Seattle, where you
oh,
live.
fun.
And the deal was that she would come up with me, and on our setup day, she could help. Like, it'd be
Mm,
fun for her. She was old enough, she could help with all the setup and everything and meet the whole crew. And then the next day was the workshop day, and she had to just be in the room. She could be
yeah.
reading, she could be coloring, like whatever she wanted to do, but she had to be, she wasn't old enough to just cut her loose in Seattle. And then the third day, I would stay an extra day and we would go to the aquarium and go to the
Go
park
play.
and go out to lunch and whatever,
Yeah,
just father-daughter day, right?
that's
So
so
she was
great.
on the day of the workshop. I'm running the whole room, right? Like, I'm the director of training. I got all this stuff going on, and I'm walking along the back of the room, and I see my daughter sitting in a chair in the back of the room. And Jack is doing this whole thing about personal responsibility, and no one can hurt your feelings unless you give him permission, and this whole thing that
Uh,
he does. Really powerful, but that was kind of the content. And I look at my daughter, and she's got the workshop workbook open on her lap, and she's sitting in the chair, and she's like following along, right,
mm.
all by herself. And I sat down next to her, and I was just watching. And I said, like, how's it going? Like, what do you think of all this? And she looks at me. I will never forget this. She looks at me and she goes, what if all the girls in middle school really understood this?
Oh, goosebumps, right? Total
I
goosebumps
know. And I
moment.
was like she just took the bullying
Mm,
immunity pill, like all the
totally.
mean girls, right? Like, there's nothing they can do to
Mm,
her because she understands that the
mhm,
reason they're doing what they're doing is they're hurting even more than anyone else is hurting, and that they
mhm,
can't hurt her feelings unless she agrees
mhm,
to it. I was
mhm.
like, as a dad, I was like, oh my God, I'm so glad you
Yes,
came.
that's like such a big important lesson.
Yeah.
No, I know. My kiddos, we talk regularly about how everybody in our life is going to make mistakes. Mommy and daddy make mistakes. We're going to do things that hurt feelings. We're not trying to, but it happens. And the very, very, very most important thing in life is how we feel about ourselves and what we think about ourselves and what we say to ourselves. And anyway, so we've talked a lot about this concept and about friends and about how teachers are going to let us down. And it's not because they're bad people, it's just because they're human. And, so one
Think
day, and
about
I,
how different that message you just said about mistakes is
Mhm.
from the main message in society about mistakes. Like, when you make a mistake, you're wrong. You should be
Oh,
punished. You should ever
yeah.
shine a bright light on it.
Mm-mm.
And we used to have something in our house called the mistake dance.
Oh, I need to hear about this.
Well, I'm not going to dance on your podcast, but it was just a silly dance, right? It didn't matter what the dance was. It was
Uh-huh.
the point was when you make a mistake, we celebrate, like we're learning something.
Totally.
There's
That's
nothing
right.
to feel ashamed about or
Mm.
to hide or be embarrassed about or whatever. It's just like point me to someone who's never made a mistake. Good
I
luck with that.
know. No,
It's
I
like,
know.
yeah.
We talk a lot about mistakes, and our son, who's also neurodiverse, right, has had his own share of challenges, but he's also a kid who will come home and be like, "Mom, I think I accidentally hurt somebody's feelings today." Like, he will self-report all day
Mm,
long. I'll be like, "Buddy, let's talk about it.
what can we
What
do about it?
happened?
Yeah.
Yeah, what do you think maybe we should do about that? Do you think that it's appropriate to, talk to them afterwards and ask them how they're doing or how they're feeling, or even just to directly apologize?" And so he's a kid who, it doesn't even matter what happened. He will just self-report. And I just have so much gratitude for his little personality that he can understand that we can work our way through mistakes.
Yeah.
It's not a stopping point, you
High five,
know?
mom. Good work.
Well, I also just have these really special kids, and I'm also a mom who, let's be clear, has made a lot of mistakes. So this is also why we talk about mistakes.
Yep, it actually ends up taking less energy than trying to hide them, right?
Oh my gosh, for sure, for sure. And
Yeah.
I also will poke them and be like, "Who loves you?" And it was like my happiest parenting moment. This would have been a few months ago before the holidays. Aiden was sitting at the table and I said, "Who loves you?" And before I could even think about what he was going to say as an answer, he said, "I do." And I was like, "Yes."
I'm taking the rest of the day off.
Totally, like, I wanted to cry. I was like, "Oh, bam, mind blown," that was instinctively and naturally his first answer. Oh, it made me so
Yeah.
happy. So, anyways, well, we could go on
So
and
s
on.
I know we could, but what's really interesting and I'm aware of is, this was supposed to be a conversation about values and all
Yeah.
that, and it is. It absolutely is because I'm really clear that what you and I landed on in terms of connecting
Mhm,
and we're still getting to know each other. We haven't known each other that long, but what we landed on here with this conversation about parenting, and I think people who are listening
mhm.
to us can tell, is that parenting is something that's very important, that's very much a high value for both of us. So once we like get once that happens, like you can't unhappen it, it's like
Totally,
it's a really great example of literally, I mean, the title of the book is Living a Values-Based Life.
yeah.
That's you and I both being authentic to what is important to us and connecting in that way. It makes total sense.
Mm. Well, and it is so fun, that concept of multiplexing where you get to relate to somebody on more than one kind of unique topic or really important topic. And which is also what makes getting to know other people just so much fun, is because we get to literally, through conversation and spending time with somebody, get to see them demonstrate their values, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, Robert, I'm so excited to send people your way and to have people be aware of you and your work and your new book, Living a Values-Based Life, which I'm going to go pick up myself now because I'm such a weirdo about values. I'm kidding. I say that jokingly, but I've literally always loved this topic. And I love your approach on it because I do think there's a disconnect often in the way that we look at and talk about values. And so I'm super excited. Obviously, I know I'm going to love it because you and I have talked about it enough now, but I'm super excited to pick up your book and actually read through the way that you present that information. And I'm so, so happy for others that get to find that as a resource. So if you're listening, pop over to the show notes. You can find those at legalwebsitewarrior.com/podcast and look for Robert MacPhee's episode. Robert, we will share a link not only to your website, but to your book, wherever you want to post that. And I think you've got it accessible on your site as well, correct?
Yes. Yeah. And we're going to set up a code so people who hear this conversation on your podcast can get 50% off on the book, and it'll be coming, if they're ordering it through our website instead of Amazon, it'll be coming directly out of my office, and they'll get a signed copy of the book as
Woohoo! Do you
well.
guys hear that? Please order it directly from Robert and not from Amazon. This is my own personal preference
Yes,
speaking.
I know. Yeah.
We could go way deep into that topic, but yes, and
It's
getting
also
us.
connected to values, but anyway.
Oh man, getting a signed copy. If I have the chance to do that, I'll do that all day long over getting a blank one. Um, Robert, where else do you live online? Do you like for people to connect with you? What other
I love for
locations?
people to connect with me, and people can go to the website, which is
Mm,
valuespacelelife.com. I'm accessible there. The book offer is there. Again, we're going to set up a code called
yes,
GUTS, which felt appropriate
love it.
for this podcast. And there's also a button on the website if people, especially if you're listening to this conversation thinking like, how does this work really apply in organizations? I know you have a lot of business people and entrepreneurs, and I have a very entrepreneurial background myself, and love working with organizations to bring this values conversation in on multiple levels. Actually, one of the most interesting things I've learned in this whole conversation is related to organizations, and how the most important factor in terms of getting people really engaged and satisfied at work is not getting them lined up with the organization's values,
Yeah.
but getting them really clear about their own personal values. And there's really good hard science behind that. And when I first heard that, I kind of went, well, I don't know. I think having them know the organizational's values really feels important.
Mhm.
But the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. You know, if someone is really clear about their own values and they're still here, then
Mm,
that means that their own values are really lined up with what we're up to in this organization.
mm,
And the ideal is when the personal values and the team values and the organizational values are all lined up, then you've got a really powerful culture. But if
yeah.
people have questions about organizational side of all this conversation, there's a way on the website to just set up an appointment. Just get into a conversation. We can talk about what's going on with your organization, whether this is a good fit or how it's a good fit.
Mm.
And I love to have those conversations with people.
Oh, I love that so much. And a reminder, because a lot of the folks that are listening are going to be small business owners, entrepreneurs that are building teams. Is you like this is such an important conversation at the
It's a
start. This
foundational
is
piece.
this
Yeah.
is not something that you have to wait until you're a bigger, more established business to do, and it's actually critical to do it at the start. And
Yeah.
to your point of like understanding your people's, your team's values, end of the day, for people to stick around and be happy at work, they have to be seen for who they are and what makes them unique and the value that they bring because of that uniqueness. They don't want to be a cog in the wheel, right?
Yep.
That's
It's
not how you
so
create
true.
the
Yep.
happiest employees. And so like this conversation around values and how this ties into somebody's, even their core identity, and really recognizing them, super important.
Yeah.
Well,
Absolutely.
Robert, I'm so excited to know you. Very, very happy to have you inside of my circle. Super excited to share out not only this episode, but your code for 50% off your book. So, folks, pop over to the show notes again, legalwebsitewarrior.com /podcast, where we will share all of those links to connect with Robert, follow his work, get access to his book. Robert, we could keep going. I'm going to cut it off, but I am going to give you one final chance to share with us. It could be a final thought, could be a favorite quote. What would you like to leave our audience with today?
Well, I think the one thing I would want to leave them with is there's a conversation that we're in over and over again about how
Mhm.
everyone understands that values are important, and yet most people don't know or can't articulate what their highest values are, and that can lead to a place of guilt, like I should
Mm,
have done this, or I didn't do it right, or what have you. And what I would want to share is just move past that, and
mm,
whether it's with our approach of separating values into two categories or whatever approach you use, but take the time, make the effort, and again, at that time where it's not an emotionally charged, really difficult situation, do it when you can be really present in the conversation, because getting really clear about your values will allow you to lead a productive, a
mm,
satisfying, and a really meaningful and purpose-driven life, because that's how we measure it. So please
mm.
accept our invitation into doing that, however you do it.
Well, I love that. And I think that to be human is to experience disconnects at points in the way that we're living and what we really wish to express through our living. So, yeah, it's and like Robert said, it's so much easier to address that stuff and sort it out and get deep into that conversation when you're not in crisis mode. Well, Robert, thank you. I so appreciate you. Really looking forward to sharing this.
Thanks for having me.